Hello there, friend. Come in. Take a breath. You found your way here, and that's no small thing. Maybe you're curled up in bed, lights low, and the night humming outside your window. Or maybe the day's just winding down, the fan whirring softly in the corner, and you're seeking a quiet place to rest your mind. However you've arrived, I'm glad you're here. This isn't just a story. It's a passage, a descent into time's long shadow. So dim the lights if you can, ease into the stillness, and let the ancient hush wash over you. And hey, I'd love to know where you're listening from. The world's a strange and beautiful place, and somehow we've met here, at the crossroads of sleep and memory. Feel free to leave a comment, share your time zone, or just sit back and let your thoughts float. Now drift with me, back, to a place where the sand remembers the dead and the wind whispers through stones older than empires. The sun breaks over the Nile like a slow exhale. Pale gold slips across the current, brushing reeds and ripples, warming the backs of ibis and the creaking timbers of merchant boats. Villages blink awake, their homes of mud brick and woven thatch tucked into the crook of the river's bend. In the distance, the pyramids rise, impossibly vast, like the bones of gods, casting long shadows over the sands. This is ancient Egypt, eternal, immense, and carved from contradiction. We imagine the splendor, the eye of Horus gleaming in painted frescoes, the treasures buried beneath earth and oath, the stories etched in gold leaf and guarded by jackal-headed gods. But behind all that, behind the dynastic power plays and divine hieroglyphs, were the quiet lives, the silent ones, and among them were the women, ever present, ever sidelined. Their stories were not written in stone, but they lived, loved, bled, and were buried all the same. Let me tell you what the papyrus never did. She was born in a year no one would record. Her name is lost, not because it was unimportant, but because she was. She came into the world in a house that smelled of hot grain and river silt. Her mother, exhausted and feverish, did not cry out when the child came. There were no midwives for women like her, just neighbors, older daughters, and the prayers of desperate hands. The baby was a girl. Her father didn't look at her. In the eyes of the law, she was property. Not the sort bought and sold, at least not yet, but the kind spoken for, protected only in function of the man who claimed her. First her father, one day, her husband. The gods may have watched her come into the world, but they would not intervene. She would not learn to write. Ink and reed pens belonged to the sons of scribes and priests. Her fingers would never run over the neat rows of hieroglyphs, those sacred shapes that carried the thoughts of kings. No, her hands would be rough, skilled, yes, but never soft. As a little girl, she would carry water jars on her back before she could read her own name. She would knead dough while other children played. Her world was shaped by fire and dust, the sting of smoke in her eyes, the constant ache in her spine. By the time her first blood came, no one celebrated. There was no rite, no song, just her mother's tired warning. Stay quiet, keep your eyes down, do not smile at the wrong man. Because her body, now blooming, was no longer hers. It belonged to expectation, to a promise her father would make in hushed conversation. Perhaps with a fisherman's son, perhaps with a tradesman's second cousin. It hardly mattered. She would be married before her 17th harvest. Marriage was not love, not here. It was duty, survival, lineage. A woman's womb was a tomb for mortality. She was expected to fill it again and again, to replace the children who would not survive. 1 in 3 died during childbirth. She knew this. She had seen her cousin die like that, eyes wide, reaching out with hands that would never hold her newborn son. The midwife had whispered prayers, but the blood would not stop. It never did. But still she smiled at her wedding, because that's what you did. You powdered your face with ground ochre and wore the finest linen your family could borrow. She stood beside a man she did not choose. His hands were calloused, his voice deep. He did not look at her as she placed her hand in his. That night she was silent. No scroll recorded her marriage. No stela bore her likeness. But she was now a wife and soon a mother. And the cycle turned, merciless as the Nile. Her home was small and always full, of smoke, of children, of work. Every day the same pattern: grind the grain, fetch the water, tend the hearth, birth the child, bury the child, wake before the light, sleep after the dark. Her body changed, became wider, heavier, bent from work and swollen from birth. Her hands cracked in winter, her teeth loosened from malnutrition. When she bled, it was from cracked skin, not a wound. She wanted more, not luxury. No, that was never promised. Just the chance to sit beneath the shade without guilt, to laugh loudly without drawing stares, to walk the market without needing a male relative beside her, to choose anything. But choice was not for her, not in this Egypt. Her brothers had become scribes, learned the names of gods and kings, mapped the stars with precision, wrote contracts, histories, oaths. She could not read what they wrote, but she knew what it meant. Men made the world. Women kept it from falling apart and were never thanked for it. One evening, while pounding barley, she heard the priests chant from the temple near the river. A funeral, a wealthy man surely by the richness of the sound. Incense, lamentation, sacred words. The body would be mummified, preserved, remembered. When her mother died, they buried her in a shallow grave, wrapped in a worn linen sheet. No ceremony, just a whisper of farewell, a handful of sand. The gods watched, but they did not help. She aged quietly, not gracefully, that was a luxury, but with dignity. Her hair thinned, her voice softened. Her children, those who survived, grew tall and strong. Some daughters married, some did not. One son became a guard at the palace gate. He never came home after the revolt. Her husband died in the flood year. She did not weep. Now, in the late light of her life, she sits alone beneath the fig tree outside her home, fingers tracing lines in the dust. Her thoughts are slow, shaped by repetition and loss. But in the quiet, something stirs. She hums a tune her mother used to sing. It has no words, just a melody older than stone, a rhythm carved into the bones of women like her. And for a moment the wind shifts, the Nile sighs, and the gods listen. The breeze moves softly over the surface of the Nile, stirring ripples that catch the fading light like the scales of a resting serpent. The sky above is shifting now, from the molten gold of late afternoon to the violet hush of evening. In the distance, the call of a water bird echoes across the reeds, low and plaintive. A single boat glides toward the shore, its sails folded, its pilot hunched and weary. In the fading light, we return to her. The woman, older now but not old, remains beneath the fig tree. Dust clings to the creases of her hands, deepened by decades of toil. She watches the river in silence, as though waiting for something. A sign, a memory, a name. Her back aches, her knees crack like dry wood when she stands, but still she moves through the rhythm of her days, unyielding, familiar. There is power in repetition, in knowing what each day will demand. It is a quiet kind of strength, but it's the only one she's ever known. She is not remembered for this. No statue will carry her likeness. No scribe will etch her lineage in papyrus. But she has lived, fully, painfully, utterly, and that alone is a defiance. Years earlier, when she was barely 20, she had watched her second child die during a hot, windless summer. The child had coughed for days, feverish and weak, his skin burning against her breast. The village healer brought crushed dates and dried chamomile wrapped in linen. It did nothing. In the end, the child's breathing faded to a whisper, and then to silence, like the snuffing of a candle. She didn't scream. She didn't weep, not immediately. She simply sat beside his tiny body, tracing his brow with the tips of her fingers, over and over again, as if trying to memorize the shape of his face before the earth took it back. When she finally did cry, it was in the fields the next morning. Her tears mixed with the wet soil as she bent to harvest barley. She was back at work, because mourning would not feed the others. Grief in Egypt did not pause life. It bled into it. Hidden beneath the routines, the rituals, the silent glances passed between women who understood. No one asked her to move on. No one asked her anything at all. One of the few freedoms afforded to women, particularly the poor, was the right to mourn, loudly, visibly, with wails and torn linen. Professional mourners were often women, hired to shriek the names of the dead, to rend their clothes, to beat their chests in wild ceremony. But she was not a mourner, not for others. And no one mourned her losses but her. There was a moment, brief like the flutter of ibis wings, when she thought of leaving, of taking her surviving children and slipping away north along the Nile, toward the city of Bastet, where they said women had more freedom, where the cat-headed goddess Bastet was worshipped not just as protector of the home, but of women too. She imagined herself there, selling herbs in the market, free from the watching eyes of her husband's brothers. She imagined laughter, hers, rising above the clamor of barter and chant. She imagined choosing, just once. But she didn't go, because dreams are heavy things, and sometimes we cannot carry them and our children at the same time. At 30, she was called aged by the women in the market. It wasn't an insult. It was a badge, a quiet nod to the years she had survived. Most of the girls she had grown up with were gone. Childbirth, fever, river accidents. One, her closest friend, taken by a nobleman who promised payment and left her broken in the fields. They didn't speak her name anymore. It hurt too much. But in the evenings, when her own daughters lay tangled in sleep, she would whisper the girl's name to the stars, just once to keep her from being forgotten. The temple walls were painted with stories of gods. Isis, who wept for her lost husband. Osiris. Hathor, mother of joy and music. Maat, goddess of truth and justice, who weighed the hearts of the dead against a feather. Sometimes she wondered if her own heart would pass the test. Was she good? Was she just? Had she done enough? She had never stolen, never betrayed, never harmed. But she had also never spoken out. Not when her cousin was struck. Not when her sister was married off to a man twice her age. Not when her own daughter cried softly in the corner after a stranger's gaze lingered too long. What does silence weigh? Would the feather tip? One afternoon, her son, the one who still lived, came home with a bruised eye and a bloodied lip. He had argued with a tax collector's boy, over bread, over pride, over being the child of a woman no one saw. She patched his wounds with practiced hands. As she worked, he looked at her and said something she would carry for the rest of her life. "You're not just a mother. You're the reason we survive." She turned her face so he wouldn't see her tears. The sun rises, the sun sets. Again and again, the cycle of Egypt, eternal, relentless, turns like the grindstone in her hands. But even in the repetition, there are moments of grace. The laughter of her daughter in the cool water of the river. The scent of coriander and honey in the evening. The warmth of a cat curling at her feet as she kneads dough. The sound of temple bells in the dusk. The feel of wind against her cheeks during the flood season, when the world is briefly green and generous. These are not recorded in history, but they are real. She never knew the pharaoh's name, not truly. She saw his likeness on coins, on temple walls, atop monuments, carved to outlast time. But she never met him, never cared to. To her, real power was not divine. It was survival. It was waking up each day and doing it all again. With aching joints, with an empty stomach, with fading hope. And somehow still loving, still singing lullabies, still offering the last bite to a child, still whispering thanks to gods who never answered. She would never be called priestess, or queen, or goddess. But in the quiet corners of history she stands, unnamed, unseen, holding up the world. The night comes slow in Egypt. It drapes itself over the land like dark linen, soaking into the crevices of stone, into the cracks between homes, into the hearts of the women who lie beside sleeping children and dream of escape. Or maybe not escape. Maybe just quiet. A moment without fear, a moment of breath, of being. She lies there now, the woman we follow, listening to the hush of insects in the reeds, to the rustle of her eldest daughter shifting in her sleep. The air is warm, dense with the smell of clay and sweat, and that faint sweetness that always follows the Nile's retreat. Her body aches in familiar ways. ankles swollen, fingers stiff, the ache of years stitched into every joint. But tonight there is something else, a tension, a pull. Change is coming, not the kind sung by priests or etched in stars, but the kind that begins in whispers, in looks, in silence. It begins with the scribe's wife. She lives across the path in a house twice as tall and painted white against the sun. Her voice is sharp, her eyes sharper. She passes the woman at market without a word, always wrapped in fine linen, always accompanied by her servant girl, a slip of a thing, no older than 13, who never raises her head. But this morning, as they pass near the date stall, the girl stumbles, and the scribe's wife raises her hand. A sharp crack. It echoes, and in that instant something shifts. The girl doesn't cry, but her eyes, wide and dark and unblinking, lock with the woman's across the market square. The woman feels something inside her stir, ancient, cold, and furious. She doesn't speak, doesn't act, but for the first time in years she feels the full weight of her silence, and she carries it home. Later that day, her youngest daughter asks, "Mama, why don't the goddesses help the girls?" She doesn't know how to answer. She wants to say they do, my love, in hidden ways, in the strength you carry, but the truth tastes bitter on her tongue. Because even Isis, even Mot, even the radiant Hathor, they are still seen only through the eyes of men, carved by men, worshipped by men, controlled. She kneels beside her daughter and smooths the hair from her brow. "They do," she says, "but sometimes they wait for us to help each other first." 'Tis not scripture, but it is something. In the weeks that follow, small things begin to change. The servant girl begins arriving at the well before sunrise. The woman meets her there, says nothing, just shares the bucket's weight. They draw water side by side in silence. She begins to notice the others too, the other women, bent-backed and quiet. Some with faces she's known for decades, some new, all tired, all wary, all watching. There is something forming here beneath the dust and duty, something wordless, a sisterhood not born of power, but of pain. It has no name, it needs none. One afternoon, she hears that the baker's wife has refused her husband, locked him out after he struck her during a drunken rage. The neighbors whisper, the men scoff, the priests frown. But that night, the woman brings her bread. She doesn't say why. She just places it in the woman's hands and turns to go. Behind her, a voice, cracked raw, says, "Thank you," and the woman feels it again. That low, steady hum of something rising. The temple chants speak of cosmic order, of Ma'at, the balance of all things. They say that to disturb it is to invite ruin, that every person must remain in their place. But who decides that place? Whose order is being protected? These questions bloom in the woman's mind like papyrus flowers after flood season. Soft, silent, relentless. She doesn't speak them aloud, not yet, but she carries them like fire beneath her tongue. Her husband's death had brought no relief, only a shifting of burdens. Now the grain owed to the overseer must be paid without his name on the ledgers. Now her son must sign for what she once bartered freely. Now her voice carries no legal weight, not even enough to testify in court. Widows in Egypt are not cherished. They are tolerated, pitied, pushed to the edges. Unless they are wealthy, unless they are royal. She is neither, and yet she endures. Every day she walks to the river and washes the family's linen with slow, circular motions, the cold water numbing her hands until she no longer feels the cracks. The other women gather there too. They do not speak often, but when they do, their voices are low, careful. Until one morning, a laugh, a real one, loud, sharp, almost violent. It bursts from the throat of the brickmaker's wife, who tells a story of her son trying to milk a goat from the wrong end. The women laugh until they cry, and in that moment the woman realizes they are not waiting for permission to live. They are doing it already, secret, in shadows, in every shared loaf and every stolen moment of joy. She begins to speak more, to ask the names of the girls married too young, to share remedies passed down from her grandmother's grandmother, ones that ease pain, slow bleeding, silence the womb when needed. She does not call herself a healer, but she becomes one. The servant girl from across the path comes to her now, quietly, with bruises hidden beneath her sleeves. The woman gives her a poultice and a story. about a time when the world was made by a goddess's tears and reborn through her rage. The girl listens, and one night she does not go home. She stays, sleeps curled beside the woman's youngest, breath deep and even. The next morning, the scribe's wife comes looking, but the door remains shut. The woman stands inside, hands folded, the fire burning behind her. There will be consequences. She knows this. But for the first time in her life, she is not afraid of them. She is tired. Yes, so very tired. But the silence, that ancient silence, has cracked. And in the space between its pieces, something is blooming. Not rebellion, not yet. But truth, and maybe, just maybe, the gods are listening again. The flood came late that year. The priest said it was the gods' will. That Hapi, the spirit of the Nile, had withheld his blessing as punishment for a growing imbalance in the world. Offerings were increased. Hymns sang louder. Sacrifices burned hotter. But the woman knew better. It wasn't the heavens that had shifted. It was the earth. Quietly, underneath the feet of men too busy to notice, women were changing. And the river, that eternal mirror of the people's soul, reflected it in kind. The banks cracked. The water rose sluggishly, dark and thick, like blood clotted in an old wound. Harvest would be lean, but something else was growing. She stood at the edge of her field, eyes fixed on the sky, fingers dug into the dry soil as if she could pull the rain from the clouds herself. All around her, the village braced in silence. Not for hunger. They were used to that. But for something harder to swallow. Disobedience. Word was spreading of the girl who had fled her master and not been dragged back, of a widow who refused to remarry, of a growing cluster of women who sat cross-legged in courtyards, muttering strange lines, sharing herbs, teaching symbols. The men did not yet call it rebellion, but they began to keep their wives close. The scribe's house no longer sent servants to market. The brickmaker scolded his wife if she lingered too long by the river. And the priest, the younger one, heavy with gold and pride, began his sermons with lines sharpened like blades. A woman's voice is like water, beautiful in stillness, dangerous in motion. The woman heard it all, and still she taught. One evening her daughter asked, "What if they come for you?" The question was so quiet it could have been mistaken for a breath, but it wasn't. It was fear made flesh. The woman looked at her, the way a flame looks at a wick. "If they do," she whispered, "then I will stand." "But what if you fall?" "I will still stand." And her daughter, child of heat and hunger and quiet defiance, nodded just once. It was enough. That night, she dreamt of the Nile as a serpent, vast and coiled, its scales made of broken papyrus scrolls, its eyes ink black and wide with knowing. It wound through the desert, swallowing bones and spitting out seeds. On its back, 1,000 women rode, veiled in linen, armed only with words. When she woke, her hands ached from fists she didn't remember clenching. The raids began on a Sunday. Not violent, not yet, just inspections, questions, names taken down, doors marked. The priest said it was for the protection of the social order. That too many women gathering in private was unsettling to the gods. But the gods, if they listened at all, were silent. The real reason was simpler. Fear, not of spells or curses, but of knowledge, of women remembering that they were more than vessels for heirs and servants of grain. And the woman, she felt that fear pressing in now, not in her bones but in the air itself. 3 nights later they came to her door. Not clerks this time, soldiers, bare-chested, spears in hand, faces set like stone. Behind them, the younger priest, his gold collar gleaming in the firelight. He didn't speak at first, just stared at her as though trying to find the man she belonged to. When he didn't, he frowned. "You've been holding unlawful gatherings," he said, "spreading teachings, hiding a fugitive girl." She stood still. "I've been feeding my neighbors," she replied, "teaching names, tending to wounds. You are not a healer. You are not a priest. You are not a man." "No," she said, "I am a woman." And that apparently was reason enough. They didn't beat her. They didn't need to. The real punishment was silence, the taking, the public shame, the message. They bound her wrists with rough rope and marched her through the village under torchlight. No trial, no defense. just footsteps and eyes. She did not cry. She looked ahead, not at the temple but at the night sky. The stars above Giza, eternal, unmoving. She wondered how many women had walked this path before her, and how many more would follow. They held her in a cell beneath the temple. Cool, stone-walled, and dimly lit. There were no chains. Just a narrow mat, a basin of water, and walls thick with the smell of oil and mildew. Time bled in that place. She did not know how long she stayed. Sometimes the older priest came. He never threatened her. He simply sat across from her in silence, as though trying to decide if she was dangerous or sad. She gave him neither. She gave him stillness. Other times the younger one came. He offered her freedom, if she confessed. If she named others, if she repented. She refused. Not because she was strong, but because the silence between her and those women, her sisters, was sacred. She would not break it for air. One morning the door creaked open. A figure stepped inside. Not a priest, not a guard. Thuppy. The girl. Taller now, thinner, but her eyes were sharp as ever. "I'm here to take you home," she said. The woman blinked. No guards, no protest. Just a nod from the old priest standing in the shadows behind her. There were murmurs of unrest in the villages, he explained. Too many questions. Too many wives refusing orders. Too many daughters asking to learn their letters. Better to let her go quietly. Better to pretend none of this ever happened. She stepped into the sun, and the heat, after so long in stone, felt like birth. They didn't welcome her with flowers. There were no songs, no feasts. Just women, waiting, watching. She nodded to them, and they nodded back. The teaching resumed that same night. Slower, quieter, but deeper. The story of one woman had become the memory of many, and in that memory, a promise. You can take her name, you can erase her marks, but you cannot stop the river. It only waits. The wind shifted again. Not a storm, not yet, but something deeper, subtler. A breath drawn across the skin of the world. The kind of wind that doesn't scatter sand but carries voices, voices long buried. The Nile moved sluggish and wide beneath the late-season sun. It was lower than usual now, its banks pulling back like lips peeled from a quiet, gritted mouth. The earth cracked. The fish died. Crops curled under the heat. But the villages were not still. Something had begun to stir. It started with the women who no longer bowed, not out of pride, but because they were tired of bending, tired of surviving inside someone else's idea of obedience, tired of silence mistaken for peace. And the men, not all but enough, noticed. Some turned colder, some turned violent, but a few began to listen. In the cool shadow of a half-finished mud brick wall, the woman sat beside her daughter, now nearly grown. The girl's hands moved slowly over a piece of linen, threading dyed fibers into symbols. Not the sacred glyphs of the priesthood, but something older, something they had invented. It was a kind of code, a way for women across the villages to write without writing. A curve meant gather. A dot meant night. 3 marks, danger. A folded edge meant truth. They called it teat, the whisper thread. They stitched it into hems, into shawls, into market sacks. No temple could ban what it didn't recognize. No man could fear what he couldn't read. One morning a clay pot was found outside the temple steps in Waset. Plain, unadorned. Inside a single piece of cloth, small, worn, and lined with delicate thread. A folded edge, 3 marks, a curve. Truth, danger, gather. The priest who found it burned the cloth, but the message had already arrived. Elsewhere, in a village near the Red Land, a woman named Heba refused to remarry after her husband died of a sand cough. The elders pressured her. Her family begged. But she remained alone, farming a small plot of flax with her bare hands. One night her home was set alight. She fled barefoot through the fields. When she returned at dawn, the house was ash. But around it 10 women waited in silence. One handed her a new clay water jar. Another brought her a fresh mat. And another, the youngest, held out a shawl with 3 tiny stitches sewn in blood-red thread. Heba said nothing. She simply tied the shawl around her shoulders and began to rebuild. In the north, near the salt plains, a girl named Kia, no more than 14, was sold to a tax collector after her family failed to deliver their grain quota. But before she was taken away, Her mother slipped something into her hand, a strip of linen. No words, no symbols. Just the faint pattern of her mother's perfume soaked into the fibers, a scent Kia had known since birth. She clutched it like a relic. On her third day in the collector's house, Kia set fire to the storeroom and escaped through the drainage tunnel beneath the granary. She ran until her legs gave out, to a field, to a river, to a group of women waiting beneath a sycamore tree. They had come for her. They knew she would come. They always knew. Back in the woman's village, things were quieter. No more priests, no soldiers, no questions. But the quiet was not safety. It was strategy. A dozen girls now came to her each week. They brought herbs, pottery, scrolls, bruises. Some came from towns she'd never heard of. Others came with questions she didn't yet know how to answer. How do I teach my son to be different? What happens when the guards come again? What if they kill me? She didn't lie to them. She never said it would be easy. She only ever said, "You are not alone." One evening, Tepi stood by the river, watching the moon's reflection break in the current. Her hair was longer now, braided with bits of shell and reed. She had grown tall, too tall to be ignored, too sharp to be silenced. She spoke rarely, but when she did, the women listened. That night she turned to the woman and said, "There should be a place." "For what?" the woman asked. "For the ones who run, the ones who can't go home." The woman nodded. She had dreamed of such a place for years. A home not guarded by men or walls, but by memory. A sanctuary written into the earth. Hidden, not to conceal, but to protect. "We'll build it," she said. And just like that, the next chapter began. They called it Shahe, the house between. It wasn't on any map. There were no roads to reach it, only paths walked by memory and instinct. It stood at the edge of the floodplain, half hidden by papyrus reeds. No gates, no guards, just a clay marker with a carved feather. The symbol of Ma'at, yes, but also now something more. A promise. A place where women could rest, heal, learn. They taught one another to write, to midwife, to argue without apology. They passed on knowledge that had no place in temples. How to birth a breech child, how to read the moon, how to speak grief aloud. Some stayed for weeks, others for years. But all who came left changed. One night, the woman sat alone in the courtyard of Shahet, listening to the cicadas cry beneath the stars. She was older now. Lines traced her face like old riverbeds. Her hands ached in the cold, but her eyes still burned. She thought of her mother, the one who'd never been allowed to learn her own name in writing. She thought of her daughter, who now taught the others how to bind wounds and shape letters from ink and ash. She thought of Tepi. Then she looked at the fire and whispered a name only she remembered. It meant to remember by breath alone, and it was enough. Because she knew they would not be erased. Not now, not ever. The river, after all, remembers every name, even the ones never carved in stone, especially those. The desert air held its breath, somewhere beyond the reach of torches, beneath stars heavy with dust and time. The land itself seemed to listen. No drums, no chants, just wind, just the sound of linen brushing against stone, footsteps over sand, the occasional crackle of fire. It was in this hush, this charged stillness, that the work deepened. Not louder, not faster, but deeper. The house between was no longer a whisper. It was a heartbeat, and every woman who passed through its doors carried that pulse back with her, like embers tucked beneath her tongue. They didn't call it revolution. They didn't need to. It was survival, sharpened into ceremony. Inside the low clay walls of Shahet, there were no kings, no scribes, no overseers, only women, only breath and bone, and stories woven by hands that had spent years doing other people's bidding. Now they stitched their own histories. In one room, older women taught girls how to grind pigment from crushed ochre and charcoal. Not for decoration, but for writing. They made ink from soot and honey, from dates left too long in the sun. They wrote on broken potsherds and flattened reeds. Not hieroglyphs. Those were sacred, guarded. No, these were shapes of their own making. Round curves for names passed down through generations of grandmothers. Sharp lines for loss. Loops for memory. The woman watched them one afternoon, her fingers resting lightly on the windowsill. She didn't interrupt. She only listened. The scrape of stylus on shard, the murmur of forgotten words finding form again. One of the girls, maybe 10 years old, looked up and asked, "What is this called?" The woman paused, then smiled. "It's called remembering." Out in the courtyard, under the shade of a bent fig tree, Tepi taught self-defense. Not the kind taught in temples or to palace guards. She had never learned that. No, this was something else. Dirt and instinct. How to fall without breaking. How to strike with the heel of the hand. How to read danger before it spoke. Her voice was quiet, but her eyes never wavered. She taught them to breathe through fear, to plant their feet like they belonged to the earth itself, to leave if they needed to, without guilt. Sometimes the younger ones cried during training. Not from pain, but from the realization that no one had ever told them they were allowed to fight back. Tepi didn't console them. She handed them a cloth and said, again. News traveled slowly, but it traveled. In the markets of Heliopolis, whispers of the place where women heal, mixed with the scent of frankincense and dried fish. In the alleys of Memphis, men grumbled that their daughters had started to argue back, and worse, to ask questions. In the outer provinces, priests delivered sermons warning against the rot of ungoverned femininity. And still the women came, some on foot, some hidden beneath goods and carts. One arrived in the belly of a trade boat, curled beside baskets of onions, silent the entire way. They came from every station, daughters of bakers, of scribes, even a servant once attached to a royal cousin. They came wounded, they came desperate, they came pregnant, broken, seething. The house between held them all, because the woman had known long ago in the stillness of her first cell that this was never about politics. It was about memory, and memory, when it is shared, becomes unkillable. But not all was peace, not always. One night smoke rose on the horizon. A neighboring village, only 2 days' walk away, had been burned. Word came by a boy no older than 12, his skin blistered from heat, his voice cracking from sand and shock. They came looking for a girl, he said. She said no. They said she had to marry. She ran. They said she was yours. She wasn't, but it didn't matter. The woman called a gathering that night. The courtyard was full, silent, lit only by oil lamps and the pale curve of moonlight. Every face turned toward her, waiting. She stood tall, though her heart sagged beneath the weight. This, she said, is what they do when they cannot find the fire. They burn the ground instead. She looked at Tepi. Tepi nodded. We do not run, the woman said, and we do not burn. The next morning, a dozen women left Shahet in silence, not to attack, not to plead, but to rebuild. They carried bundles of flax and grain, clay pots of water, a goat, and cloth dyed the deep blue of mourning. When they reached the ashes of the village, they didn't ask permission. They began laying bricks, side by side with the survivors. When a priest rode in 2 days later to survey the damage, he was met by women who didn't bow, who didn't smile, who didn't explain. He left without saying a word, and so it continued. For every house burned, 2 were raised. For every name erased, 3 more were written. For every silence enforced, a dozen new stories bloomed in hidden rooms and midnight courtyards. The woman watched it all with a heart that ached in equal parts pride and fear, because she knew. She had always known that they would come for her again. The question was only when. One night, as the sun dipped low and the air turned thick with heat, the woman sat by the fire with Tepi. Neither spoke. The flames danced. The fig leaves rustled. At last, the woman said, I feel them watching. Tepi didn't ask who. She only said, then we'll make them see. And in the distance, beyond the reach of firelight, beneath the shimmer of a blood-orange moon, shadows gathered. Not all of them friendly, not all of them afraid, but none of them prepared for what memory had become. The night was too quiet. Even the frogs had stopped their singing, the kind of stillness that feels like a held breath, like the sky itself was waiting for something to break. The woman rose from her mat before dawn, bones aching the way they always did before change. She stepped barefoot across the cool floor of Shahet, her fingers grazing the clay walls she had helped shape with her own hands. There were no lamps lit yet, but she didn't need them. She knew the house like a second skin, the rhythm of its rooms, the hush of its corners, the breath of its sleeping walls. Outside, the stars were fading into that bruised blue just before sunrise. And on the horizon, movement. Not the soft approach of new arrivals. Not the cautious shuffle of women seeking refuge. No, this was something else, something heavier. Hooves, armor, dust. The watchwoman, a former servant girl with a burn scar across one cheek, ran into the courtyard moments later. No words, just a look. A sharp, cold look that said what no whisper could. They were coming. By sunrise, everyone was awake. The children were packed into the old store cellar, deep beneath the kitchen floor. Women moved like water, fast, silent, practiced. The injured were hidden, the most vulnerable disguised. Pots turned to weapons, blankets became escape packs. No screaming, no weeping, only breath and movement. The woman stood in the middle of it all. She didn't yell. She didn't panic. She simply nodded, slow and sure, as if this had all been rehearsed. Because it had. Not this exact day, not this exact way, but the possibility, the inevitability. They had always known that memory would provoke fear. And fear always comes armed. The soldiers arrived by mid-morning, clothed in the red and black of provincial command, dusty, impatient, sweating beneath their bronze helmets. They bore scrolls sealed with Pharaoh's crest, accusations of sedition, theft, blasphemy, disorder. The charges didn't matter. They never had. Their eyes swept the compound, looking for men, looking for secrets, looking for someone to punish. The captain dismounted and strode to the gates. "We are looking for a woman," he said. "There are many women here," the watchwoman replied. "Not like this one," he snapped. "The one they call Mother." The woman stepped forward, not dressed in linen, no symbols, just a plain robe, a smear of ash on her fingers. She met the captain's eyes and said, "Then you found her." They didn't strike her. They didn't shout. Instead, they offered her a choice. Come quietly, or burn. Not just Shehet, they said. The villages, the women, the children, everything. You will be the cause of their destruction. You will be the reason they die. That was the threat. That was the bargain. She looked past the captain, at the women lining the courtyard walls, at Tepi, face hard as stone, at the girl who had arrived 3 days earlier with bruises she hadn't explained. And she understood. This was never about punishment. This was about erasure. They wanted to rip her from memory, from myth, from the fragile web of stories that had begun to stitch the country back together in secret. She took one step forward and whispered, "I will go." They bound her wrists. They covered her head with a reed veil. And as they led her through the gates, past the fig tree, past the water jars, past the lines of watchful faces, she heard something. It wasn't crying. It wasn't shouting. It was humming. Low. Steady. A vibration that began in one throat, then another, until the whole of Shahet was filled with it. A sound like stone beneath water. A sound like a mother's voice on the edge of sleep. A sound that said, "You are not alone." The soldiers didn't understand. They looked at one another, nervous now, unsure why the hairs on their arms were rising. The woman smiled beneath the veil, because she understood. This wasn't goodbye. This was a planting. They would take her body, yes. They might even take her life, but they could never again take her silence. They marched her for 3 days. No food. Little water. At night, she was tied to the inside of a hollowed-out grain silo, left to listen to rats scurry beneath her feet. They tried to frighten her with tales of execution, with promises of disgrace, but she did not shake. She did not weep. Instead, she whispered to the walls. Not prayers, not curses, just names. Every girl she had sheltered, every woman who had fled, every child born in the safety of Shahet. She gave those names to the wind. Let it carry them far from her. Let them take root elsewhere, because names cannot be burned. On the 4th morning, they reached the temple fortress, a sun-bleached monolith of authority. Here, they said, she would be judged. Here, her crime would be weighed like grain. A panel of priests awaited her, all robed in white, their hands stained with ink, their eyes hard from years of seeing only what they were told to see. They read the charges. They asked no questions. They did not let her speak. When it was done, the chief priest looked down at her from the dais and said, "Do you understand the punishment?" She raised her chin and said, "Do you understand the legacy?" Silence. The wind rose outside the chamber walls, stirring dust from the floor. She smiled, because she could hear it again. That low hum, even here, even now, carried through stone, carried through time. The story would not end here, no matter what they did, no matter how deeply they buried her. Because memory does not obey, and neither do the women who keep it alive. The punishment was not swift. That would have been mercy. No, what they planned for her was a ritual. Public, deliberate, and designed to erase. Not just her body, but her idea. She was to be paraded, bound in reeds, veiled in dust, silenced. The scribes had already prepared the scroll that would declare her name unspoken. A damnatio memoriae, the ancient sentence. To blot her from the story of Egypt itself. It was more than death. It was annihilation. The unraveling of memory. They marched her to the edge of the city square, a place where stone columns towered like watching gods, and sun beat down on the heads of those forced to kneel. It was there, in the very heart of power, that they would break her, or so they thought. She did not flinch, not when they cut away the robe, not when they forced her to kneel, not even when the priest stepped forward, voice ringing out across the gathered crowd, intoning her sentence in a voice thick with pride. This woman, known by no rightful name, has violated the sanctity of order. She has poisoned the hearts of women, turned them against their fathers, their husbands, their gods. She has rejected the divine structure and dared speak truth not given to her. For this she shall be struck from the scrolls, from the walls, from the mouths of her people. She shall be forgotten. She shall be unmade. The people watched, some with pity, most with fear, none with resistance, except one, a girl, barely 12, eyes sun-dark, arms trembling. She stepped forward, just one step, no more than a whisper of movement. But the woman saw her and smiled. The sentence continued. They would not kill her outright. They would cut her hair, the symbol of womanhood. They would brand her tongue, to mark her speech as cursed. They would send her into exile, not death but exile, into the black land, the deep desert, where only jackals dared live. But they had not planned for what happened next, because memory is not just carried in scrolls or stone. It lives in breath, in mouths, in song. The humming began again, low, from the edges of the square, unnoticed at first, mistaken for the wind, then louder, voices, women's voices, old and young, one by one stepping forward, not rushing, not screaming, just there, in linen robes, in rags, in silence and in song. From alleyways, from behind carts, from balconies and rooftops, they came, not to fight, not to plead, but to witness, to refuse to look away. The priests faltered. The crowd turned. The humming filled the square like water rising. A name passed from lips to lips, unafraid. Not her given name, the one scratched into temple scrolls long ago. No, the one she had earned. The one they whispered in kitchens, in bathhouses, in fields of grain. The mother between. Not forgotten, never erased. The priests shouted for silence. The guards raised their weapons. The chief priest lifted his hand to strike the brand. But his wrist never fell. Because the young girl, the one who had stepped forward first, now stood between him and the woman. Unarmed, unmoving, her voice clear and soft. You will not touch her. The silence that followed cracked the air like thunder. Because in it, everyone remembered something they had been taught to forget. That power, once believed eternal, can shatter in a single moment of courage. The guards did not strike, not because they had been ordered not to, but because their hands began to shake. They looked at the faces in the crowd, not angry, not violent, but watching. Hundreds of eyes, 1,000 witnesses, and suddenly they were not sure whose side history would take. The brand was lowered, the scroll of erasure torn in half by its own keeper. The priest's voice faltered, and the woman rose. No one dared stop her. She walked barefoot through the square, hair shorn, wrist still bound, but taller than any of them. She did not run. She did not look back. She passed through the columns like smoke, like a vision, like prophecy. And the people parted for her, not in fear, but reverence. She walked for 3 days, not toward Shahet. That place was no longer hers to protect. It had outgrown her. It had become more than one house, more than one dream. No, she walked into the desert, into the silence, into the deep black land where the bones of forgotten queens slept beneath the sand. And when she found a hollow among the rocks, she sat and waited. They say she was never seen again, but they lie. She was seen in the bending of reeds by the riverbank, in the red flash of a woman's scarf in the marketplace, in lullabies passed from mother to daughter, songs about fire that never dies, in stories of a woman who could not be silenced, no matter how hard the world tried. She did not return, because she did not need to. She had become memory itself. And memory once free does not beg to be remembered, simply remains. The desert has a sound, not loud, not obvious, but if you sit long enough, if you let the silence stretch between your ribs and pull at your thoughts like old thread, you begin to hear it. The sand speaks, in the whisper of grains shifting beneath your feet, in the sigh of wind-carving valleys no map records, in the hush of things buried, bones, stories, names that once shaped the world. This is where she walked now, far from the Nile, far from the green edges of the river's breath, far from temples, scrolls, punishment. No guards chased her, no birds circled. She was alone, but not lost, not broken, because something had shifted, not just in the city square, but in the pulse of Egypt itself. The priests had tried to unmake her, but what they did instead was awaken something older than even they remembered. The old stories, the ones told not by scribes but by grandmothers, by firelight, by sweat and whisper, the stories the temples feared. In a shaded hollow between two ridges of red stone, she paused. Her feet bled, her lips cracked, her body begged for water. But her eyes still burned. And in the silence, she remembered the voice of an elder woman long ago, a midwife with a crooked spine and hands stained with henna. There are two deserts, she had said, the one that kills and the one that reveals. She had never understood that, not fully. But now she did. This was not exile. This was emergence. That night, the stars stretched wide above her, a dome of salt and fire, too many to count. She lay against a rock still warm from the day, and whispered again. Not names this time, but questions. What would they say of her 500 years from now? Would the priests bury her in some shallow footnote? Would the men erase the humming from their retellings? Would the girl who stepped forward be remembered? Or replaced? Or claimed? She closed her eyes and felt the answer settle deep in her chest like a heartbeat that wasn't hers alone. They would forget her name, but not her defiance. They would forget her face, but not her silence. In the morning, she was not alone. A shape approached on the edge of the ridge. Slender, sun-browned, barefoot, a traveler. No more than 20 summers. Dust in her braids, a clay flask at her side. She said no greeting, just sat cross-legged a few paces away, offered the water. The woman took it, drank slowly, handed it back. Silence passed between them like an old thread. Then at last the girl said, "They call you Ghost." A pause. "They say you disappeared into the west where souls go." Another pause. "But I knew that wasn't true. I knew you weren't finished." The woman looked at her, took in her hands, scarred, strong, eyes like stone in dusk, and asked, "Why did you come?" The girl shrugged. "They're asking questions now, about who writes our story, about why we only ever see one side." The woman tilted her head. "You came to find answers?" "No," the girl said, "I came to find you." For days they spoke little. The girl made fires, gathered desert herbs, listened, watched. She never asked to be taught, and the woman never offered to teach. But things passed between them anyway. How to trace water from stone. How to read the stars not for gods but for direction. How to recognize a lie not by its words, but by what it forgets to say. At night they told stories. Or rather, the girl did. Stories from the edges of the empire, of mothers refusing to name their daughters after queens who betrayed them, of women who sang in the fields to hide messages in plain sight, of girls who vanished only to return stronger, stranger, wiser, carrying with them maps no one else could read. The woman listened, eyes half closed, heart wide open, because the story was spreading, and she was no longer its center. One evening, as the sky burned gold and violet, the woman took the girl's hand and placed something in her palm. A pendant, rough, made from bone and copper, etched with a symbol that no longer belonged to any priest. A circle, open on one side, A doorway, a memory, a beginning. The girl looked at her. What does it mean? And the woman answered, it means they failed. In the years that followed, more came. Not in crowds, never all at once, but slowly. Like seeds blown on desert wind, they came with questions. They came with songs. They came with anger and wonder and grief. And every time she welcomed them, not as a prophet, not as a goddess, just as a woman who had once refused to disappear, who had learned that stories, when hidden long enough, grow wild, and once they bloom, no blade can cut them down. The desert became a whispering archive. There were no walls, no scrolls, no scribes with ink-stained fingers, but history lived there, passed not in monuments but in moments, in shared firelight, in the slow peeling of silence, in the gathering of voices long ignored. By the 10th season they had stopped calling it exile. Now it was something else entirely. A place you sought when the world had told you no. When your questions had been laughed off, your body used, your name twisted or silenced or stolen. A place where women came not to be saved, but to remember who they were before forgetting became survival. They built no city, no temples, no hierarchies, only circles. Circles of stones to mark fires, circles of woven mats where stories could unfold without interruption. Circles where no one sat higher than anyone else. The first time a girl tried to call the woman priestess, she stopped her. No, she said gently. There are already too many altars in the world. Too many thrones dressed up as wisdom. Then what are you? The girl had asked. And the woman replied, I'm just someone who stayed. Word reached the river towns slowly. Rumors of a ghost woman in the Black Land. Of a gathering of mothers, sisters, daughters. None of them sanctioned, all of them dangerous. At first the officials ignored it. Desert madness, they said. A myth to make young women restless. But when the daughter of a vizier disappeared, and when temple workers began whispering a strange new song while grinding grain, and when wives refused to name their newborns after male ancestors, choosing instead names drawn from old, outlawed tales, the priests began to worry. They sent spies, men with dry lips and sandals too clean for desert work. Some never returned. The ones who did came back changed, silent, or haunted. Oryx, in one unforgettable case, openly weeping. He had been found in the square, barefoot, clutching a pendant carved from sun-bleached bone. They don't fight, he said over and over. They don't fight, but they win. One scroll survived from that time. A letter, unsigned. Perhaps it was smuggled by a scribe's daughter. Perhaps it was composed in secret by a priestess who had watched the world tilt and could no longer lie. It read, we told them the gods made women lesser. We etched it in stone and taught it in temples. But what we feared most was not their weakness. It was what they might remember, if ever they stopped believing us. Back in the desert, the woman aged. Lines carved her face like riverbeds. Her voice grew quieter, but her presence only deepened, like a shadow at dusk, long and undeniable. And still the women came. They brought clay tablets from broken schools, scraps of stories overheard in palace corridors, wounds that had never been given names. One brought a scrap of linen with a single hieroglyph sewn into it. Ren, name. This was my sister's, she said. They buried her without one. The woman took it in her hands, kissed the faded thread and whispered, then we name her now. It wasn't just women anymore. Boys came too. Boys whose mothers had taught them not to mistake power for worth. Who had grown tired of being told their softness made them weak. Who had seen what violence did to fathers, to brothers, to themselves, and wanted no part of that inheritance. They sat in the circles. They listened. They wept sometimes. And slowly they unlearned. There was no single language for what this place had become. Not a sanctuary, not a rebellion. It had no leader, no decree, no sword. But it spread, like wind-borne seed. It spread through lullabies and salt trails, through carved pendants and secret prayers, through a smile shared between two strangers who recognized each other as mirrors. It did not call itself revolution, but it was, and through it all the woman remained. She did not speak often now, but when she did, her words stayed, etched not in stone but in breath. One night around the fire, someone asked her, "When did you know you wouldn't be forgotten?" She smiled softly, eyes lit with starlight, and said, When they tried to erase me and you came looking anyway. No one spoke after that. Not because they were afraid, but because sometimes silence is the holiest language. And on that night, in the middle of the vast empty land once meant to erase her, a story stood taller than any pyramid. Not the story of a queen or a god, but the story of a woman who refused to disappear, and in doing so taught others how to remain. The wind carried her name now, not her given name, the one spoken by her father, written in contracts erased by decree. No, that one was dust. The name she wore now was older, born not from birthright but from resistance, passed in murmurs from mother to daughter, etched quietly into stones at the edges of fields, drawn in ochre on the inside of clay jars, tucked into the corners of kitchens, whispered over the cribs of daughters born during the waning moon. They called her many things: the quiet flame, the one who stood, the uncarved tablet, but beneath them all was the same truth. She had refused the forgetting, and because of that, the forgetting had begun to fail. In the far city, the one with golden roofs and painted walls, a priest dropped his stylus. He'd been copying hymns when the thought struck him like thunder. What if everything he had ever written was a lie? What if the silence in the records was not absence, but erasure? What if their scrolls were not chronicles, but cages? He did not finish his hymn. He walked out into the night and never returned. Some say he followed the trade routes searching for the woman. Some say he found her and wept in her presence. Others say he never found her, but died with a different kind of peace. The kind that comes from unlearning. The desert did not bloom, not in the way poets would later claim. There were no miraculous rivers, no sudden trees, but what did grow was stranger, quieter, more enduring. Knowledge, in the hands of women who had once been forbidden to read. In the minds of girls who had been told their voices were too soft for truth. In the backs of clay tablets passed hand to hand, bearing not God's decrees, but memories. Recipes for healing salves, moon cycles, names, hundreds of names. Women whose lives had been reduced to ashes and offerings, now remembered. Rewritten, reclaimed. In one story, an elder arrived from the northern coast. Skin wrinkled like crumpled papyrus, eyes like stone. She had once served a queen, had been present when scribes burned her likeness, when statues were smashed, when temple girls were locked behind veil and vow. She sat before the fire for hours, saying nothing. Then finally she said, "I remember when the world turned cold." The woman listened, not with pity but with stillness, with recognition. And when the elder finished, when the last word cracked like dry clay in her mouth, the woman reached across the flames and placed her hand on hers. "You are not alone in remembering," she said. And in that moment, the weight of history shifted. Just slightly, but enough. More than memory was being restored now. Choice. What to keep, what to discard, what to refuse. In the village beyond the cliffs, a girl refused the marriage chosen for her. Cited the name of the woman in the desert. They said she had no father, the elders muttered. No God, no husband. And still she spoke. The girl was beaten, but did not bend. And when the bruises faded, she began to teach younger girls how to read. Her home was later burned, but her students had already memorized the stories. They say the woman aged like stone, slowly, deeply, imperceptibly. Time touched her differently. Some claimed she was immortal. Others said she had died long ago. And what lived now was a memory strong enough to hold form. Both were wrong. And also, somehow, both were right. Because she did not live like other people. She lived like story, like myth that had not been broken, only buried. One night, lightning danced over the horizon. No rain came, only the light, forks of silver tearing briefly through the ink-black sky. She sat alone that evening. Even the stars kept their distance. And in that quiet, she heard a voice, not spoken, but known, familiar as blood. It was not calling her home. No, it was reminding her of a promise made long before language. To carry the silence of the forgotten until it broke open into song. She stood. Her back was curved now, her steps slower. But each footfall stirred the sand with purpose. She walked past the circles, past the stones, past the pendants and stories and the lives built gently atop hers, and found the ridge where she had first met the girl with the dust in her braids. She looked out, over the horizon, toward the place where the river still coiled like a jeweled serpent, pretending nothing had changed, And she smiled, because she knew better. They all did now. The forgetting was breaking, and in its place something else had taken root. Not empire, not revolution, but remembrance. And in that there was power no throne could hold. The sun rose without sound, just a slow bleeding of gold into the edges of the horizon, soft, unhurried, inevitable. In the circle of stones, women began to stir. They moved like shadows at first, quiet and careful, as if not to disturb the silence the night had left behind. Embers still pulsed in the fire pit. Someone added dry twigs. A curl of smoke rose like a question. But she wasn't there, the woman, the one whose presence had anchored them like gravity. Her mat was empty, her pendant gone. No note, no farewell, just absence. They searched at first, fanned out across the dunes, called her name, the new name, the one born from fire and refusal. But the desert answered only with wind. At the ridge, they found the faint impression of her footprints, half swallowed by the sand. They didn't follow, not out of fear, but reverence. Some things are not meant to be chased. Some endings must be met in silence. That night, they did not speak much. The circle was smaller than before. The girl with the dust-braided hair, now a woman herself, stood beside the fire. She held the old woman's cup in both hands. It was chipped along the rim, smelled faintly of mint and ash. She didn't drink from it. She just held it like a memory too sacred to use. And when she finally looked up, her voice was clear. She didn't leave us. A few heads turned. She became part of what we carry. She gestured at the stones, the sky, the fire. She's in this now. And slowly, one by one, the others nodded. Not in agreement, but in understanding. They began to tell the story, not as scripture, not as law, but as breath, spoken beneath the stars, braided into the songs of grain harvest, drawn in ochre on the sides of children's toys. Her story, their story, not of conquest or miracle, but of staying, of refusing to vanish, of choosing not to go quiet into the cage of history. Back in the city, the temples stood untouched. Gold still glittered. The high walls still cast their long shadows across the squares. But the hush was different now. There were cracks, not in the stone, in the certainty. The scrolls remained, but girls were beginning to question them. A market woman refused to use her husband's name on her ledgers. A former temple servant opened a school, not for boys, but for daughters of potters and weavers and water carriers. And in the alleys, children played a new game. One would pretend to be a priest trying to erase names. The others would laugh and scatter, leaving behind small pendants shaped like open circles. One day, a young scribe found an old carving buried in a broken jar. It bore no king's mark, no temple crest, just a face worn smooth by time. And beneath it, in faint, almost invisible lines, she stayed when they told her to vanish. She listened when the world forgot to speak. And in her silence, we remembered ourselves. The scribe showed no one, but that night she whispered those lines into her sleeping sister's ear, and the next morning her sister whispered them to someone else. And by dusk, a servant girl was singing them while sweeping the temple floor. That's how it moved now. Not through power. Through presence. Not through decree. Through echo. A movement without banners, without war, without leaders or followers. Just a deep, quiet remembering. Of the woman. Of her fire. Of the truth she had carried like a wound. And offered like a gift. Years passed. And still the desert did not forget. The circles remained. Changed sometimes, but never broken. And in each, the story continued. It didn't stay the same. It grew, as stories should. As people do. The woman was no longer the center, but she was the seed. And wherever women gathered, not in rebellion, but in remembrance, she was there. In the way they held silence. In the way they named their daughters. In the way they faced the world, not with rage, but with the unshakable knowledge that they belonged, even when no one said so, especially then. And on certain nights, when the wind brushed just right across the stones, when the fire dimmed and the stars trembled on the cusp of speech, some say you could hear it, not a voice, not a word, but the quiet presence of something unbroken, still walking, still watching, still remembering. The seasons moved like breath now, slow, sacred, imperceptible unless you were truly watching. The circles in the desert no longer held the same faces. but they still held the same truth. Some women had grown old there, the lines around their eyes deepening like rivers into rock. Others arrived young and wide-eyed, carrying nothing but a question they had never been allowed to ask. And always, always the fire was waiting. It didn't demand a story. It didn't judge silence. It simply offered warmth and time. In a fishing village far from the desert, a girl found a smooth stone carved with an open circle buried beneath her grandmother's garden. She carried it in her pocket, fingers tracing its edges like a prayer she didn't yet understand. At night, her grandmother told her of a woman who had vanished into the sands, a woman who taught others how to stay. They said she walked away, the old woman whispered, but really, she sank into the land and now she grows there. The girl asked if the story was true. The grandmother only smiled. True? She echoed. Child, it's truer than truth. Elsewhere, in a dry, cracked field where grain once grew, a woman stood before a tribunal. They had summoned her for teaching girls how to read. She did not deny it. She stood with her hands clasped in front of her, sand still clinging to her robes, her hair streaked with ash. You broke the law, one elder said. No, she answered softly. I remembered something older than the law. They sentenced her to silence. But before the guards could drag her away, someone in the crowd stood, then another, and another, not with fists, not with flames, but with their names, spoken clearly, aloud, like an incantation. I am Lysa, daughter of no master. I am Rema, who named myself. I am the child of the one who stayed. The tribunal fell quiet. The sentence was never carried out. The story had become a constellation now, no longer bound to one woman, one place, one time. It pulsed across lands, across languages like a song hummed by 1,000 mouths. It changed with each telling. Sometimes she was a healer. Sometimes a runaway. Sometimes a ghost who whispered to the daughters of kings. And sometimes, most beautifully, she was no one at all. Just a feeling, a knowing, a weight in the chest that said, I deserve more than silence. In a city library long thought lost to flame, a wall was found behind a wall. Inside, hundreds of clay tablets, no royal seals, no histories of war, only memories. Women's names, poems, recipes, letters never sent. One simply read, I didn't want to die without being seen. A scholar found it, wept in the dim light, and copied it by hand. Then she wrote her own beneath it. I see you, I see all of us. A little boy once asked his mother why the circle was open, not closed like the sun. She paused, looked at the fire, then answered, because we are still becoming. And in that answer, the shape lived on, an unfinished loop, a space for return, a symbol not of completeness, but of continuation. In the desert, the sand did what sand always does. It moved, covered, revealed. One morning, a traveler stumbled across a single stone jutting from the earth, worn, weathered, ancient. No inscriptions remained, just the faint outline of a footstep, small, soft, stubborn. He didn't know whose it was, but somehow he bowed his head anyway, not from duty, but from awe. And though no one spoke her name aloud anymore, not because they forgot, but because they no longer needed to, the air still remembered. When girls danced barefoot on cracked temple floors, when mothers refused to shrink beneath a father's fury, when daughters taught their brothers how to listen, when stories were told not to glorify kings, but to honor the ones who endured without a crown. She was there, in the pause between words, in the breath before truth, in the space history forgot, where the fire never went out, where the circle always remained open. The world had changed, not in the way emperors dream of. No toppling of thrones, no banners raised in fire, no armies marching under a new dawn, but in the quiet ways that last, in a loom's rhythm, passed from grandmother to granddaughter, in a question asked out loud, in a place where once only silence was allowed, in the absence of fear where fear had lived for generations. And in that stillness, that soft unfolding, the woman's story continued. No longer hers alone, but 1,000 threads weaving through lives, seen and unseen. There was a village now, near the edge of the marshes, where the reeds grew thick and sweet. No temple overlooked it. No roads led directly there. But people found it, or rather, they were drawn to it. Not by maps, but by memory. Not memory of facts, but of feeling. The kind of knowing that lives in the body long after the mind forgets. The kind that makes your feet walk before your thoughts catch up. They came from cities, from mountains, from ruined towns. Widows, healers, singers, runaways. Some brought books, others brought only grief. They didn't ask to stay, they simply arrived. And the women who lived there made room. At the heart of the village was a stone platform. Nothing ornate, just a circle, open on one side. Around it, flat stones for sitting. Not a place of worship, but of listening, of remembering. There were no rituals, no priestesses, only the stories people brought. And the silence that followed them, tender, reverent, unafraid. One evening a girl sat there alone. She had run from a life where her voice was considered too loud, her hands too restless, her thoughts too dangerous. She clutched a broken necklace, not valuable, just hers. She said nothing for hours. Then as the sun dipped low, she whispered, "I don't know who I am without being afraid." An elder sitting nearby, skin like burnt clay, eyes bright with sorrow and humor, simply nodded. "Neither did she," she said. But she walked anyway. The next morning, the girl helped gather reeds, helped mix the clay, helped shape bricks. Not because she had to, but because someone showed her how. And when she made mistakes, no one laughed. When she cried, no one hushed her. And when she finally smiled, small, hesitant, no one asked why. This too was her story now. The villagers never wrote down laws. They carved patterns, symbols, lines that meant "I see you," curves that meant "there's space for you here." And the circle, always the circle, open, incomplete, inviting. On the outer walls of their homes, they painted hands, overlapping, outstretched, reaching, not to grasp, but to hold. One day, a stranger arrived, pale and sharp-eyed with ink-stained fingers. A historian. He asked to see the temple. They said there was none. He asked to read the scrolls. They showed him the walls. He asked to know the name of the founder. The eldest among them smiled. "She has no single name," she said, "only the names we give her." But who was she? A woman who stayed. "That's not enough," he muttered. "It was for us," she answered. That night the historian sat by the fire, listened, heard no doctrine, only a weaver humming a tune as she threaded her loom, a child reciting the names of her mother's mothers, a song with no words carried in the breeze. And he understood, slowly, painfully, that this was not history written for men like him. It was history lived, felt, protected. He didn't write a book, but he left behind his journal, tucked under a stone near the open circle. Inside, he had scrawled one sentence. They built no empire, but they remembered, and that somehow was stronger. Elsewhere, in places forgotten by maps, others began to echo what had grown in the marsh village. Not copies, not colonies, but reflections. Different names, different songs, but the same root. The same resistance, not in battle but in breath. In joy, in naming themselves without apology, in loving without permission, in enduring without explanation. And always, when the fire dimmed, when the children were asleep, when the night was its darkest, they told her story again. Not for her, not to preserve her, but to remind each other that she had once walked where no path was allowed, that she had once said no when silence was safer, that she had once stayed when vanishing would have been easier. And because of that, they had stayed too. The stars were quiet that night. Not still, never still, but quiet in the way a heartbeat is quiet beneath layers of cloth and skin and time. The fire was low, the circle smaller than usual. A few women sat shoulder to shoulder watching the flames, their faces soft with the kind of weariness that lives deep in the bones. One woman braided another's hair. A child lay across her mother's lap, fingers twitching in dreams. No one spoke. They didn't need to. The story was already in the air. Like smoke, it curled and clung and settled into the spaces between them. Not as memory, but as presence. And if you listened, really listened, you could hear it breathing. She was gone, of course, long gone. Her bones lost to time, her footsteps devoured by shifting sands. No grave, no monument. But that was never the point. She hadn't stayed to be remembered. She had stayed to remember, to bear witness to something no one else dared look at, to feel the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders and still say, "I am here." To carry that silence like a wound, until others learned to speak again. They say no one knows what finally became of her. Some say she wandered into the desert and became one with the dust. Some say she transformed, not into myth but into movement. Some whisper she still walks, not as a ghost but as a spark in the eyes of girls who dare to question, dare to want, dare to be. And some, the oldest ones, say she was never just one woman, that she was always many, that she is many, a fragment in every voice that refuses to disappear. In the centuries that followed, kings rose and fell, temples crumbled. New gods were carved into old stones. Historians revised what had never truly been known. And the story, the quiet one, the inconvenient one, kept slipping through the cracks. Not gone, just waiting. Waiting for a lull in the noise. For a breath of stillness. For someone willing to ask, what was it really like? To live in a world where your name could be erased, and still choose to leave it behind anyway. Somewhere a child holds a small clay pendant in her hand. It's rough, imperfect, ancient. Passed down through more hands than she will ever know. The circle on it is open. Her mother told her it means there's still more to come. That the story isn't finished. That she is part of it now. Not just a listener, but a voice. A presence. Path. And as the wind stirs through the reeds, as the sky spills stars like stories, as the fire dwindles into ember and ash, she steps forward, and the circle begins again. And now, dear one, the fire fades. The echoes soften, and the story, like sand through your fingers, slips gently back into the dark. But it's not gone. Not really. It lingers, in breath, in bone, in the quiet turning of your thoughts. If this journey stirred something in you, a memory that was never yours but still feels like home, let it sit with you a while. And when you're ready, tell me, where in the world were you listening from tonight? What time is it where you are? I'd love to know. If you haven't already, dim the lights, turn on a soft fan, let this voice carry you wherever you need to go next. And if you'd like more forgotten echoes, more soft stories woven with dust and dusk, subscribe. Join me again. There are so many more shadows to wander through together. Until next time, rest well, stay curious, and remember, the past never really sleeps. It only waits for someone quiet enough to listen.